He's one of those guys. He's one of those dudes that looks like shit. He's fat, but he's like, look at that fucking pig. I'm not going to fuck that fucking pig.
Yeah.
Right.
Because it's a problem is that if they got a big, thick old neck, it's so hard to get the bone saw through all that meat. And it's a good, nice, petite young girl. Ooh, so nice. You just take a paring knife, slip. You got a head all your own. And that's exactly what he was. He's a bumblebutt. And so he's kind of a pain he has to be around. And he's probably knocking over your glass figurines.
Accidentally,
and walking around.
though.
Yeah, because he's so big, waddling his big fucking fat ass all over the fucking kitchen.
She said, because of you, my murderous son, I haven't had sex with a man in 5 years.
Oh, it's because your bush is all hairy and it smells like random tuna.
Yeah.
Hey, who's the psychopath here, you or me?
I can't tell you how many times that I've been told that I should listen to the last podcast on the left. I'm not a big podcast person in general, but considering my infatuation with good, evil, and human rationale, I would obviously also have a mild infatuation with studying serial killers. With that said, I like to know who people are, where they come from, what they did, why they did it, understand what led decisions to be made. I like even more to understand the complete background, what the person thought of themselves, what they thought of those around them, and explore their past, the point of view, and how those things manifested themselves through the crimes or the actions of the killer. This also allows me to interpret and understand better the actions and viewpoints of non-killers. Because, if you can understand the extreme, you can usually dial it back to understand the lesser extremes. It sounded to me like the last podcast on the left would have been a match made in podcast heaven. It's one of the biggest podcasts I've heard that covers serial killers and creepy stories. Perusing their playlist, I saw stuff about ghost stories, odd news that's usually a little more on the gruesome side, or aliens, the recent midget woman who pretended that she was an orphan and tried to kill her adoptive parents, all kinds of stuff. Their playlist is extensive. They've been going on for a number of years now, and it seemed interesting, so I took a look at it, but the problem came when I actually turned it on. I wasn't sure how to describe what I heard or what my response was at first. It wasn't an emotional response. I liked when they actually covered the subject information, but then when their personalities came in, when the jokes and their snide remarks, there was something that wasn't sitting right with me. I listened to the podcast first about Richard Chase, and I listened to the side story about Ghost second, though I didn't make it through the whole podcast. Finally, I turned on the episodes about Ed Kemp, the co-ed killer. There were 2 episodes for this specific topic, and it was during this time that I was finally able to put into words what I had felt while listening to the podcast. It wasn't the content. It wasn't the heinous criminals or their merciless crimes that were being spoken about that bothered me. I had expected that. It was the invisible monsters telling the stories. So I have a mildly unorthodox approach to studying criminal backgrounds or just listening to people. I don't simply summarize every bloodstained name in our history as, quote, just a monster, unquote. In fact, I think it's one of the most irresponsible and dismissive things that you can do when you're talking about troubled people. By saying someone is just born a monster or saying, they were just doomed to have that ending, you take the responsibility for their actions out of the hands of the person who committed them. They were just doomed, you say, and you also take the responsibility of the maltreatment away from those who might have been abusive, neglectful, or had some otherwise adverse effect on someone's life. This line is so lazy and so gross to me because it says no matter what you do to someone, no matter if you torture them or mistreat them or neglect or rape or expose them as children to something that they cannot comprehend and should never see, it will have no effect on them whatsoever. It means that parents, guardians, and people around them, any person really, has absolutely no input or effect on the type of person that someone might become. So go ahead, treat them however mercilessly you would like, because it's not like it's going to change them, and it's not like it's going to come back and hurt you. They were just doomed to be a monster to begin with. On the flip side, it also tells On the flip side, it also tells the killers and criminals that they shouldn't be held accountable for their actions because they had no choice in the matter. It was just in their nature, their genes. They were born to be that way, just like you might be born to be black or Asian or with a heart condition or physical disability in some way. Being born with something makes it immutable, and thus, can you really condemn somebody for something that they were born with? Can you condemn a black man for being born a black man? Can you condemn a tiger for having stripes instead of spots? Can you condemn any wild cat for its need to eat meat? But if you turn the fall of human into something that you're born with and evil actions aren't a product of an environment, but a destiny, then you take away any ability to condemn them in the person. It was just their nature. It was just the natural order of things after all. We need to acknowledge that monsters aren't born. They're made, and our actions very much inspire and assist in the creation of these people we look at in terror and ridicule. Every human, regardless of how bad they have ever been, is still that. They're just a human. From a Christian standpoint, they have fallen from grace for one reason or another, just like any of us, and they have the ability to be redeemed. But that's another subject entirely that I'll cover at another time. The dismissal that people who commit evil actions are just born with an evil heart of Satan is also an excuse for, quote, regular people, unquote, to act just as monstrously because they don't have the blood on their hands, but don't pretend that the insults from your lips aren't just as damaging. I like to describe the human condition as this. Two things make up the majority of our actions and our decisions. One is our biology. We might be predestined to certain types of mental illness or decision making or whatnot because of our genetics. We have a beaker, a body with our emotions, our experiences, our point of view, that's all in there. But then the beaker isn't lethal on its own. You have to add the extra chemicals which might make it explode, and those are the experiences. You mix the correct chemicals together and you will get criminal behavior. This is why not everybody who's been murdered, this is why not everybody who's been raped or mistreated as a child turns into a murderer, but you can see common threads through those that do. And that brings me back to the last podcast on the left. What I couldn't stand was their downright sadistic attitudes towards humiliation, degradation, vengefulness, resentment, brash anger, and hatred. Look, I get it. You really can't ask people not to hate individuals who have committed some of the most depraved and evil acts in our past, especially some that are extremely recent. But the anger, resentment, hatred, and sadism was not only directed at people like Ed Kemper, Jeffrey Dahmer, or Ted Bundy. The hosts try to be funny, and sometimes they are. And obviously, many people also enjoy their jokes, so I'm not going to say it's not comedy because I don't like some of it. But they are cruel-hearted in their delivery. Their subjects and punchlines often sound vengeful in the sort of way you'd laugh at a kid for being trapped in a locker that says faggot because you didn't like him either. Probably deserved it. The jokes aren't meant to be funny so much as they are made with foul intentions meant to attack, not just the target of their research and scrutiny, but anyone they deem enemy enough to relate back to their subject. In one of the Ed Kemper episodes, or maybe both of them because it's been a few weeks since I listened to it now, it was Ted Nugent they wished had gotten killed. And they also took a couple of shots at Gamergaters. First, they set up Ed Kemper, then they created a parallel target by saying Kemper was like Gamergaters and described their caricature of a Gamergator. And then, because they hated Kemper because he was evil, you also hate the Gamergaters because they're just like him, so they must be right. The setup goes something like this. Just like Ed Kemper, Gamergaters are just angry, sweaty dudes who don't know how to talk to women and think they deserve Jessica Alba just for existing. But they're all fat slobs. Losers, fucking losers, fucking losers. Give me that laugh track. That's what I'm talking about. This just in, profanity and yelling does not equate comedy, unless you're a 5-year-old. And to be honest, whenever I see excessive swearing or hear excessive swearing in something, I can't help but think low IQ. Don't be confused though, I'm not saying that comedy can't have swearing in it, and I'm not saying regular people can't swear, but excessive swearing makes me think certain intellectual things about you, I'm just saying. Now, I'm not an authority on what makes people laugh or what's appropriate to laugh at. There's insult comedy, there's harsh comedy, and then there are jokes that are insults that you laugh at. A lot of people also find it funny to humiliate, demonize, and insult people or things they personally hate. You see a lot of this with atheist jokes about religion if they hate Christians, or personality roasts from someone who doesn't like the subject of the joke. Usually it falls pretty flat. There's a big difference in the style of the joke that comes from a place of spite or anger versus even an ounce of admiration or respect. Saturday Night Live has done multiple comedic skits now about assassinating Trump. There's a link in the description below about at least one of them. And while I don't particularly see the joke in LMAO, wouldn't it be funny if this dude was dead? I'm not trying to dictate whether stuff like that should be considered funny to those who want to laugh at it because I don't laugh. But what I wanted to bring attention to by talking about this podcast and the beasts they cover is the lack of empathy that's normalized in our society, to the point that jokes are all about shame, humiliation, dehumanization, killing people, and especially targeting those that we don't like. The comedy of the last podcast on the left is a commentary about who we are and what we find acceptable and good. Cruelty is part of the American culture now. Jokes and stories are created specifically to tear others down, and they run rampant in comedy, political landscape, and even in regular conversations. It first seeped into the culture by attacking those we see as villainous, because who would dare defend social monsters? We can all agree those guys are evil, so let's make fun of them. Now, we've normalized it to the point that many consider different political ideas demon enough to laugh at the hurt, death, and demise of someone, or to wish it upon them and think that's funny. I agree with Andrew Breitbart when he said politics is downstream from culture. Political discussion doesn't influence culture or behavior. What happens in our culture influences the political discussions and behaviors acceptable on and off the debate stage. And what culture tells me right now, what the last podcast on the left and other programs like it tell me, is that we are a society that doesn't value compassion. We are quickly bleeding compassion. What's not being talked about is how dangerous it is. The first mainstream flag we've had recently that brought up the danger of an uncompassionate world was Todd Phillips' Joker that just opened 2 weeks ago. In a recent interview a couple weeks back, Phillips told IGN, quote, "The movie makes a statement about lack of love, childhood drama, lack of compassion in the world, and I think people can handle that message," unquote. After having seen this movie earlier this afternoon, I agree. It is completely about compassion. It is completely about the consequences of zero compassion, of lack of compassion, and of isolation because of that lack of compassion. He's not the first to speak this message, that we need to care for each other, and he won't be the last. But it seems that very few people listen to these warnings. The criminal Karl Panzram, who the guys at the last podcast on the left also covered at some point, he had no hope, no desire to be around people, and was utterly disgusted by the state of the human heart. Back between the 1900s and 1933, he committed larceny, sodomized over 1,000 men, and murdered, I think, around 20. When he hit the final jail of his life in Kansas, he was given life in prison. That was it. He had prisoners' rights group defending his life, although Kansas wasn't a capital punishment state and hadn't been for over 60 years. For months, Panzram fought with the courts about ending his life and giving him the death penalty. After another outburst attack where Panzram brutally assaulted a couple of guards, even using a metal pipe, he said, "If you don't kill me, I will keep attacking and keep killing who I can until you finally stop me." That's not an exact quote. That's a summarization because I don't have his paperwork right in front of me now. Kansas complied and put Panzram to death for the first time in over half a millennia. And before he died, he gave the warning: if you don't want people to be like me, don't treat them the way you treated me. Of course, a criminal will always try to get out of taking responsibility for their actions, but it shouldn't be shirked that the way we treat people will also change how they react to the world and the people around them. And the lack of compassion I see in people nowadays is staggering. Regular people. I'm not sure how else to describe them. They're not behind bars. Theoretically, they haven't committed any major crimes, but listening to the words of an uncompassionate person isn't any different, whether it's from Ted Bundy or some random girl on the street who calls out and celebrates the pain put on... But listening to the words of an uncompassionate person isn't any different, whether it's from Ted Bundy or some random girl on the street who calls out and celebrates the pain put on someone else. Go to many videos on YouTube. Go to especially any video on maybe somebody that people like a little less in pop culture. And you will see different comments that are so unkind that if you saw them out of a killer's mouth, you wouldn't be surprised. It makes sense, you'll say, and you see the ideas high-fived by supporters of likes and voices chiming in, "You're right, the sick fucks. You got what was coming to you. You deserved it. Good. Die." And everyone who disagrees, "You're just as sick." We laugh at each other because we find cruelty entertaining. How is that any different than someone that takes delight in melting down animals, in beating a dog, in delighting in the pain caused to someone else through the torture and murder? Words are different than actions, sure, but words can also express the cruelty in our hearts, and we need to be careful. God also said that if you think it in your head, then it's as if you had done it, and that refers to the intentions of your heart. You can be cruel without ever having broken a man's leg on purpose. We seem to be moving closer to a society of psychopaths. That is, a society of disconnected individuals, manipulators, narcissists, where cruelty is the status quo and the way to make you popular among your peers and the greater community. The normalization of cruelty as part of our culture creates a lack of guilt, empathy, and deep emotional attachment to others. It also creates a larger vacuum for dishonesty, risk-taking, superficial charm, and impulsive behavior. Maybe you don't care. So long as so many agree with you, how could this cruelty be the wrong kind? So long as the target is approved, how could cruelty ever be such a bad thing? That guy deserved it. Everybody agrees. Maybe the target really doesn't matter. Maybe you really don't see the difference between casual cruelty in a conversation and how it connects to or affects society. Think of what Jeffrey Dahmer did. Then think of what his murderer did, who killed him in prison and said God sent him to do it. Think of the people who cheered, who still cheer, that Jeff was killed in prison that day. What makes one murderous passion more righteous than another? You'll find me hard-pressed to believe every single stranger in the comments who have never met Jeffrey Dahmer, who didn't know the families, who have never lost someone to who have never lost a loved one to someone like him, have righteous anger where their desire for blood is somehow holier than John Wayne Gacy's. People cheer for the blood of their enemies, of their targets, because it makes them feel better. And that's not justice, that's vengeance. What does angrily calling for the blood of a dead man do? What's the difference between asking for someone else to murder so that you can feel good and being one of the guys that does the murdering themselves? Lack of compassion goes far beyond making merciless jokes at serial killers on podcasts. The average person is bloodthirsty. The average human heart is vengeful and self-righteous. I'd argue probably just as much as any of the worst monsters in society that are supposed to be condemned. If any of the big-named murderers never acted out but kept their murders in their thoughts, maybe on a blog for you to read and enjoy, would you still consider them to be on the same level of sickness because they're thinking the same thing? What if these blogs were written about real people? They were just written down versions of their plans that they shared. Would it be any better? If you call for the bloody death of someone you hate or the misfortune of your enemy, how are you not just as bad? All I could say is be careful. Compassion is a powerful thing. Just the smallest bit can change someone's life. But suck the compassion away, and you might find monsters are a lot closer than you thought. You might find the monsters are living inside of yourself.